In July 1955, Pan Am Flight 914 left New York City Airport en route to Miami. The plane and its 57 passengers seemingly vanished into thin air.
On a hot July morning in 1955, a plane took off from New York with 57 people on board. It was headed for Miami, but it never landed. For 37 years, the flight was a total mystery until it suddenly showed up on a radar screen in Venezuela in 1992. The plane that landed wasn't a new jet, but an old propeller plane from the past. It returned with a secret that seems impossible for our world to explain. The impossible arrival. The arrival of the silver aircraft in Caracas is the moment where the world of the ordinary collided with the world of the impossible in a way that left everyone involved changed forever. To understand the weight of this event, you have to imagine the scene at the Simon Bolivar International Airport on that strange morning in 1992. The sun was high and the humidity was thick, making the air feel heavy as ground crews moved about their usual business of refueling modern jets and loading luggage onto massive carriers. In the control tower, the atmosphere was routine until a faint, scratchy sound began to crackle over the radio frequencies. It was not the crisp digital audio of a modern cockpit, but a sound full of static and age, like a recording from a forgotten basement. When the radar technicians looked at their screens, they saw a blip that had appeared out of nowhere, not coming from any known flight path or approaching from the usual commercial corridors. This was a ghost in the machine, a signal that defied the logic of the highly regulated airspace. As the plane emerged from the hazy clouds, the people on the ground stopped what they were doing to stare at a sight that made no sense. It was a Douglas DC-4, a massive propeller plane with 4 engines that looked like a shiny silver time capsule. This kind of plane had been the king of the skies in the years following World War II. But by 1992, it was a relic that belonged in a museum or a scrapyard. Yet, there it was, descending toward the runway with its landing gear down and its engines humming a deep, rhythmic song that modern jet engines simply cannot replicate. The metal skin of the aircraft was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the Venezuelan sun so brightly that it almost blinded the workers on the tarmac. There were no signs of rust, no faded paint, and no marks of the decades that should have passed since its construction. It looked as if it had been maintained by a crew that lived in a world where time had stopped moving forward. In the tower, the confusion turned into a kind of quiet panic. Juan de la Corte, the lead controller, tried to establish a clear line of communication, his voice steady but his mind racing to find an explanation. When the pilot finally spoke, his words were polite and professional, yet they carried an undertone of deep, unsettling confusion. The pilot identified himself as being in command of a flight from New York to Miami, a route that was thousands of miles away from where he currently hovered. He spoke of his passengers as if they were just minutes away from their destination, complaining about the heat and asking for a gate number. The tension in the tower grew thicker when the pilot was asked for his flight plan and his date of departure. When he replied that he had left New York on July 2nd, 1955, the room went completely cold. The controllers looked at each other with expressions of pure disbelief, wondering if they were the victims of a very elaborate and expensive prank, or if they were witnessing a miracle. The most interesting part of this encounter was the visual connection between the two different worlds. As the plane taxied closer to the terminal, the ground crew could see the passengers through the small, rounded windows of the DC-4. These were not ghosts or monsters. They were people dressed in the fashion of the mid-50s, with men in narrow ties and fedoras, and women with carefully styled hair and white gloves. They looked out at the airport with a mixture of curiosity and growing terror. They saw giant Boeing 747s and strange futuristic ground vehicles that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. To the people on the plane, the world had changed into a foreign planet, in the span of a single morning. The physical proximity of these two eras, the 50s metal sitting on 90s asphalt, created a psychological friction that is still studied by mystery hunters today. It was a moment where the linear flow of history was broken, leaving a group of travelers stranded in a future they were never meant to see. The situation reached a breaking point when the pilot realized that the voices in his ears were telling him the year was 1992. He began to shout, his professional tone dissolving into a high-pitched, frantic energy. He warned the ground crew to stay away as they approached with steps and fuel lines, waving them off as if they were invaders. He seemed to realize that if he stayed on the ground for too long, he might become trapped in this strange new world forever. The sound of the engines changed from a low idle to a desperate roar as he prepared to flee. In that final chaotic moment, as the pilot gestured wildly out of his side window, a small object fell from the cockpit and landed softly on the runway. It was a tiny pocket calendar, a simple piece of paper that would later become the most debated piece of evidence in the history of the unexplained. Without waiting for a clear path or permission from the tower, the pilot turned the silver beast around and accelerated. The plane lifted off, banking hard away from the airport and disappearing into the clouds as quickly as it had arrived. The aftermath of the arrival left the airport in a state of stunned silence. The radar screens, which had just been tracking the mysterious craft, went blank once again. There was no trail to follow, no signal to track, and no radio response to the frantic calls from the tower. All that remained was the smell of old aviation fuel in the air and the small 1955 calendar sitting on the ground. This section of the story is the most powerful because it presents us with a physical mystery that cannot be easily dismissed by logic. It forces us to imagine the terror of the pilot and the shock of the controllers. Two groups of people separated by time, but connected by a few minutes of radio static. It is the core of the legend because it offers a glimpse into a world where the rules we live by, that time only moves forward and that the past is gone, are suddenly and violently proven wrong. While the arrival in Caracas serves as the heart of the mystery, we must travel back to the day the clock first stopped to understand the scale of the disappearance. The flight of 1955. To truly appreciate the shock of the plane's return, we have to immerse ourselves in the world of 1955, an era that felt permanent and stable to those living through it. Pan Am Flight 914 was not just a number on a board. It was a symbol of the booming post-war American dream. On that July morning at Idlewild Airport, the air was filled with the smell of coffee and tobacco, and the sounds of bustling families heading toward the promise of a Florida summer. The 57 passengers who climbed the metal stairs into the Douglas DC-4 represented a cross-section of mid-century life.
On July 2, 1955, a Douglas DC-4 airplane with 57 passengers and 6 crew members took off from New York City, bound for Miami, Florida.
There were businessmen in heavy wool suits carrying leather briefcases, mothers holding the hands of children dressed in their Sunday best, and couples looking forward to the vibrant nightlife of Miami. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of quiet excitement. The seats were wide and upholstered in thick fabric, and the windows offered a clear view of the 4 massive piston engines that would power their journey. For these people, the flight was a luxury, a fast way to bridge the 1,000 miles between the skyline of New York and the palm trees of the South. The Douglas DC-4 was a masterpiece of engineering for its time, a 4-engine giant that had helped win a world war before transitioning to civilian service. It was a rugged, reliable machine that pilots trusted with their lives. On this particular day, the crew was led by a captain with years of experience, a man who had flown through storms and fog without ever losing his cool. As the engines began to turn, A rhythmic thumping vibrated through the floor of the cabin, a sound that gave the passengers a sense of power and safety. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, passing by other silver aircraft that looked nearly identical. When the control tower gave the final clearance, the pilot pushed the throttles forward. The roar of the 1,450 horsepower engines filled the cabin, and the plane began its long roll down the asphalt. As the nose lifted and the ground fell away, the passengers looked down at the expanding grid of New York City, unaware that they were leaving their own timeline behind. The first few hours of the flight were perfectly routine, the kind of boring success that every airline strives for. The plane followed the coastline, staying within range of radio towers that tracked its progress as it moved southward. The pilots checked in at regular intervals, reporting their altitude, their speed, and the local weather conditions. Everything was going according to the flight plan. Below them, the Atlantic Ocean stretched out in a deep, endless blue, dotted with the white wakes of ships moving toward the harbor. The sun stayed high in the sky, reflecting off the wings of the plane and creating a sense of peaceful suspension. In the cabin, the flight attendants served drinks and snacks, moving gracefully through the narrow aisle. It was a scene of perfect order, a small bubble of civilization moving through the vastness of the sky. There was no reason to suspect that this flight would be any different from the thousands that had come before it. The mystery began when the plane reached a point near the coast of Florida, where the radio contact should have been at its strongest. Without warning, the signal simply cut out. It wasn't a slow fade or a crackling message about engine trouble. It was as if the plane had been unplugged from the world. The ground controllers in Miami waited for the next scheduled check-in, but the radio remained silent. They called out to Flight 914 repeatedly, their voices becoming more urgent as the minutes ticked by. They reached out to other planes in the area, asking them to keep a lookout for a silver DC-4 or to listen for a distress call on the emergency frequencies. But there was nothing. The radar screens, which were much simpler in those days, showed an empty patch of sky where a large passenger plane should have been. For a few hours, the authorities hoped it was just a radio failure. But as the time for the plane's arrival in Miami came and went, the hope turned into a chilling realization. The plane was gone. The disappearance triggered a massive search and rescue operation that gripped the nation's headlines. The United States Coast Guard and Navy deployed a fleet of ships and aircraft to scour the Atlantic. They calculated the wind speeds, the currents, and the last known position of the flight to create a grid of the most likely crash sites. Pilots flew low over the water for days, their eyes straining to find any sign of debris, an oil slick, or the bright yellow of a life raft. Divers were prepared to investigate any shadow on the ocean floor. Despite the scale of the search, which covered thousands of square miles of open water, they found absolutely nothing. Not a single piece of luggage, not a scrap of metal, and not a single life jacket ever washed up on the shores of Florida or the Caribbean. It was as if the ocean had opened up and swallowed the plane whole, leaving the surface of the water as smooth and undisturbed as a mirror. As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Flight 914 began to stall. The official reports were filled with unknowns and possibilities, but there were no hard facts to explain how a massive aircraft could vanish in clear weather without a trace. The families of the 57 passengers were left in a state of permanent grief, stuck between the pain of loss and the lack of closure. Without a crash site or bodies to bury, some clung to the impossible hope that the plane had landed on a remote island or had been hijacked. But as the years passed, those hopes faded into the background of history. The files were closed, the insurance claims were settled, and the names of the passengers were etched into memorials for the lost. The world moved on from the era of the DC-4, entering the age of the jet engine and the space race, leaving the mystery of the missing Pan Am flight to gather dust in the archives. For 37 years, the flight was treated as a ghost story of the aviation world, a tragic example of the risks of early air travel. It was a story told to young pilots about the importance of communication and the unforgiving nature of the sea. No one could have predicted that the story wasn't actually over, but was merely on a very long pause. The silence of 1955 was a deep well that seemed to have no bottom, until a single radio transmission in 1992 proved that the plane hadn't crashed at all. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to reappear in a world that had forgotten its name. This transition from a forgotten tragedy to a living miracle is what makes the Caracas encounter so shocking. The silence lasted for nearly 4 decades.
In 1955, Pan Am Flight 914 headed for Miami took off from New York City and disappeared, only to reappear almost 4 decades later.
Until a shocked air traffic controller in a different country heard a voice from the past calling out through his headset. The Caracas encounter. The morning of September 14, 1992, at the Simon Bolivar International Airport, was supposed to be just another day of managing the complex web of South American air travel. The air traffic control tower was a hub of modern technology, filled with the hum of computer cooling fans and the steady beep of advanced radar sweeps. Juan de la Corte, a man who had spent years guiding high-tech jets into the narrow corridors of the Caracas Valley, sat at his station with a cup of coffee, watching the digital icons dance across his screen. The weather was beautiful, the kind of clear blue sky that usually makes a controller's job easy. However, the peace was shattered when an unidentified blip appeared on the radar. It didn't have a transponder code, meaning it wasn't sending out the electronic handshake that all modern planes use to tell the tower who they are. To Juan and his team, this was an immediate red flag, possibly signaling a substance runner or a private pilot in deep mechanical trouble. As the object drew closer, the visual confirmation from the tower windows sent a wave of confusion through the room. Through high-powered binoculars, the controllers saw a ghost. Emerging from the heat haze was a Douglas DC-4, its 4 massive radial engines churning the air with a deep, low-frequency thrum that rattled the glass of the control tower. The plane was painted in the classic blue and white livery of Pan American World Airways, a company that had long since changed its look and had recently even gone out of business. The aircraft looked as though it had just been rolled out of a hangar in the 50s. Its aluminum skin was polished to a high-gloss shine, and the propellers moved with a synchronized perfection that suggested a brand-new machine. It didn't belong in 1992. It looked like a black-and-white photograph that had suddenly come to life in a world of vibrant color. Juan de la Corte keyed his microphone, his voice professionally calm despite the drumming of his heart. He asked the pilot to identify himself and state his intentions. The response that came back over the radio was chilling. The pilot's voice was clear, sounding like a man from a different era, clipped, formal, and utterly bewildered. The pilot stated that he was in command of Pan Am Flight 914, en route from New York to Miami, with a crew of 4 and 57 passengers. He reported that his scheduled landing time was 9:55 a.m. on July 2nd, 1955. The controllers in the tower froze. Some looked at their calendars, others at their modern digital watches. There was a long, heavy silence as the reality of the statement sank in. Juan took a breath and informed the pilot that he was over Caracas, Venezuela, and that the current date was September 14th, 1992. On the other end of the radio, the pilot's professional tone shattered. He began to gasp, his voice rising in pitch as he repeated the date in disbelief. He could be heard talking to his co-pilot in the background, their voices filled with a raw, primal fear. "Something is wrong," the pilot shouted into the radio. "We shouldn't be here." Despite the confusion, the pilot began his descent. The DC-4 handled beautifully, its large wings catching the Caribbean air as it lined up perfectly with the runway. Ground crews, who had been alerted to an emergency landing, lined the tarmac. They were prepared for fire or a crash, but they weren't prepared for the sight of a 1955 airliner landing smoothly on a 1992 runway. As the wheels touched down, the smoke from the tires was the only thing that seemed normal about the situation. The plane taxied toward a remote area of the airport, away from the sleek, modern jets that were now boarding passengers for London and Paris. Juan and his supervisors watched from the tower as ground security moved in. They wanted to help, to offer food, fuel, or medical attention to the people on board. But as the security teams got close, the pilot's window slid open. The captain of Flight 914 looked out, and his face was a mask of sheer terror. He looked at the fuel trucks, which looked like giant yellow insects to him, and the uniforms of the guards, which were unlike anything he recognized. He began to scream at them to stay back, waving a small flight logbook as if it were a weapon to keep the future at bay. Through the passenger windows, the ground crew saw the faces of the travelers. They looked like people from a time travel movie, their expressions frozen in a state of total shock, as they stared at a world that had aged 37 years in the blink of an eye. The most famous moment of the encounter happened when the pilot reached out and accidentally dropped a small laminated pocket calendar onto the asphalt. It was a tiny thing, but it represented a huge mystery. As the guards tried to move forward to retrieve it and talk to the man, the pilot's fear turned into a desperate need to escape. He didn't want to be part of 1992. He wanted his own world back. He slammed the window shut and engaged the throttles. The four engines roared to life, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and exhaust that forced the ground crew to dive for cover. Without a clearance from the tower and ignoring the sirens of the emergency vehicles, the DC-4 began to move. It taxied back onto the main runway, the pilot's eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could see a doorway in the sky that no one else could. The disappearance of the plane for a second time left the witnesses in a state of shock, clutching only a small piece of paper as proof that they hadn't imagined the whole thing. Into the vortex. When we are faced with a story that breaks the laws of physics, we naturally look to the edges of science to find an answer that makes sense of the chaos. The idea that a plane could travel through time suggests that our sky is not just empty air, but a complex map of dimensions that we do not yet fully understand. Many researchers who study these anomalies suggest that the plane might have flown into a wormhole. In simple terms, a wormhole is like a shortcut through the fabric of space and time. Imagine holding a piece of paper that represents the universe. If you fold it in half, 2 points that were far apart suddenly touch. If Flight 914 flew into a fold like this in 1955, it could have exited the other side in 1992 without the passengers aging a single day. To the people on board, the trip would have felt like a normal 3-hour flight, while the rest of the world watched decades pass by. This theory is popular because it uses the language of real physics, even if we don't have the technology to prove such portals exist in our atmosphere. Another theory that people often discuss is the concept of a time slip. This is a phenomenon where the past and the present briefly overlap, like two radio stations playing on the same frequency at the same time. Some believe that certain areas of the Earth, particularly over the ocean, have unique magnetic or electrical properties that can trigger these slips. If the weather conditions were exactly right on that July day in 1955, the plane might have been caught in a pocket of time that was disconnected from the rest of the world. This is often compared to the Philadelphia experiment, a famous legend from World War II, where a Navy ship was said to have vanished and reappeared in a different location. These stories suggest that our reality is much more fragile than we think, and that under the right circumstances, a person can fall through a crack in the calendar. The psychological impact of this idea is what keeps it alive in our culture. We have a deep, almost instinctual fear of lost time. The thought of leaving home for a few hours and returning to find your children are old and your house is gone is a powerful theme in mythology and science fiction. In the case of Flight 914, this fear becomes a mystery we can't stop talking about. If a natural portal really exists in the sky, it means that any of us could be next. It turns the act of flying from a routine task into a gamble with the unknown. Some fringe theorists even suggest that the government knows about these vortices and has mapped them out, keeping the information secret to avoid a global panic. They point to other famous disappearances, like those in the Bermuda Triangle, as evidence that there are certain dead zones where the rules of the universe simply stop working for a while. Beyond the hard science and the conspiracy theories, there is also the idea of glitches in the Matrix. This is the belief that our world is a sort of programmed reality, and that, occasionally, the code fails. A plane landing 37 years late is the ultimate error message. It forces us to ask if time is actually a straight line, or if it is a giant circle where everything is happening at once. If time is a circle, then the 1955 pilot didn't really travel to the future. He just took a detour into a different part of the loop. This makes the story feel less like a ghost tale and more like a window into the true nature of existence. These theories give us a way to talk about the impossible without using the word magic, providing a bridge between our daily lives and the vast, terrifying mysteries of the cosmos. Even if we never find a wormhole in the Atlantic, the possibility that one could exist changes how we look at every plane that disappears from a radar screen. Even though these theories about time portals are exciting to think about and offer a strange kind of hope, a closer look at the actual evidence reveals a very different and much more human origin for this mystery. Deconstructing the myth. While the idea of a time portal is exciting, the true origin of Pan Am Flight 914 is found in a very different place. This story did not start in an aviation logbook or a government file, but in the pages of a tabloid called the Weekly World News. Famous for printing wild stories about aliens and monsters, this paper published the first version of the tale in 1985. They claimed the plane returned after 30 years, but later updated the story in 1992 to say 37 years just to make it feel current. The paper used a specific formula to make the mystery feel authentic. They included a photo of a witness named Juan de la Corte, which researchers later discovered was just a stock photo. When experts looked for records of a missing flight on July 2, 1955, they found nothing. A disappearing airliner would have been front-page news globally, yet the historical record is completely silent.
All shreds of evidence point to Pan Am Flight 914 never happening. Nonetheless, the story has become an urban legend, with many versions retold over the years. Some versions of the tale extend to the part where the plane passengers returned to their families without having aged a day, while all the people they knew had aged naturally.
The legend grew because the tabloid used names and dates that made the fiction look like real journalism. Before the internet, it was difficult for people to double-check these facts. Over time, creative details like the pilot's calendar became facts in the public's mind. Even after the paper closed, the story lived on through the internet as a modern myth. It proves that a well-told story is often more powerful than the truth because it taps into our deep sense of wonder. The fact that the story is a fabrication does not make it less important, as it reveals something fascinating about how we process mystery. The legend of Flight 914 endures because it speaks to our hunger for the unknown. We live in a world where satellites track every movement and data explains every event. Yet we still crave the idea of a sky that holds secrets. Even as a fabrication, the story acts as a modern myth, reminding us that the human imagination is the ultimate time machine. We keep watching the clouds, hoping that one day the impossible will finally decide to land. If you enjoyed this journey through the impossible, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the world's greatest mysteries.